So I have the honor to introduce former Senator Fran Pavley. Fran served in the 29 years in the elected office. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Pavley was elected the first mayor of Agoura Hills in 1982 and served 14 years in the California Assembly and the state Senate. Former state Senator Pavley authored the landmark climate policies AB 1493, AB 32, SB 32, and others that have created a market for innovation and investments in clean energy and vehicles, which have helped clean up our air, grow the economy, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As chair of the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, she was able to pass the state's first Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, promote policies to protect our ocean and watersheds, and adopt measures to create more sustainable local water supplies. Fran received the National Caucus of Environmental Legislation Award for Outstanding Accomplishments in 2017. She's working as Environmental Policy Director for the USC Schwarzenegger Institute and serves on several state and local advisory boards and committees. Please let's welcome Fran Pavley. Thank you. And all you do is hit the space bar to go down.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a former middle school teacher, so you have to do better than that in the response. Just to warn you. Good morning. Okay, good. We probably should make everyone get up and move around some if you're like middle school students who don't like to sit in your seats very long. Okay, I'll get closer to the microphone. Thank you. Pleasure for me to be here today, and as a former middle school teacher, I really enjoyed listening to these students, high school and college students. They did a great job, and their passion is to be commended. It's an all hands on deck kind of situation. And yes, I was one of those people who grew up in the 60s and the 70s on a college campus for the first Earth Day, which is 50 years ago next year, so gear up for that on messaging already. And I wanted to just comment briefly on a few things they said, because some of them were incredibly important. The young woman who was talking about what it means to her personally on health outcomes and living close to a refinery or oil drilling, really important conversation, because the conversation that resonated the most in Sacramento and probably nationally is that link to health, public health outcomes. That's what people care about. And our independent polls by our Public Policy Institute every July on environmental issues show that air pollution related problems are the number one concern across all income groups. And so that's a uniting factor, and there's no doubt that climate change and air pollution and growing asthma rates and warmer temperatures and heat episodes are all interlinked together. So that's a really important message, and personalizing it means everything. I think that's very effective. So tell those personal stories. And also, can't remember what individual talked about helping close down the 3 natural gas power plants. Congratulations on that. I represented Western LA County and lots of Ventura County over my 14 years in the legislature. And on a similar note, about a year and a half ago, the California Energy Commission and the PUC, of all, Public Utilities Commission, I have to remember not to speak in acronyms, decided to close down 2 natural gas power plants along the Oxnard coast in Ventura County. I don't know if you were aware of that. And it was a discussion that was brought about, just like in LA, about a interesting piece of legislation years and years ago. I wasn't directly involved in, but it was called Once Through Cooling, how to reform your natural gas plants so they're not using so much ocean water. And so that was going to cost millions of dollars. And so the time was running out for those existing plants. They only last about 25 years, and the timing was absolutely right, especially with the Aliso Canyon and other senses of urgency on methane, that we need to move off natural gas. Because if you live in California, you know that natural gas has really taken the place of coal. But we have to eliminate not only coal, but we have to eliminate our growing dependence on natural gas. So that'll be probably the biggest biggest challenge. So I really appreciated the comments, the energy, the focus, and the activism from that next generation who's going to have to figure out how we address this problem. All right, so there's not going to be a quiz afterwards, and you probably can't even see this. I don't know if the PowerPoint's available, but the purpose here is to let you know California's climate policies just didn't begin the last year or two. They've been in place really since the 1960s. The 1960s. Why? Smog. Good. That is the answer to the question. Smog, it was air pollution, impacts on public health, growing numbers of housewives, because women didn't work back then, or not too many did, started talking to newly elected Governor Ronald Reagan about doing something about the smog. If you grew up in the San Fernando Valley like I did in the 60s, and I see a few heads shaking, yes, you couldn't go out to recess to play on many days. They were red flag alert days. The smog was that bad. I didn't even know there were mountains across the San Fernando Valley over half the days of the year. That was before catalytic converters, unleaded gas, and the list goes on and on. Even with our little population and few cars, it was absolutely horrible and linked to public health. So that's how we got started. In the 60s, the Air Resources Board was established. Then, eventually in 1970, the federal government, on the first Earth Day, passed the Federal Clean Air Act and the Federal Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. And just for a note of bipartisanship, that was with President Richard Nixon that was done. And so we've been in this space for many, many years. And the important thing about the Federal Clean Air Act is because California predated the Federal Clean Air Act with our investment and regulatory efforts in reducing smog, we have an exemption under the Federal Clean Air Act to pass more stringent automobile emission standards than the federal government. That is what is under attack right now in Washington, D.C. Our decades of efforts of creating cleaner and, yes, more fuel-efficient cars is poised to be eliminated. We think it would have to take an act of Congress. There will be lots of lawsuits, and hopefully we will prevail. Also, under the Federal Clean Air Act, other states have two choices. They can adopt California's tailpipe emission standards for cleaner vehicles or stay with the less strict federal standards. As of now, we have about 14 states that have joined California. So there's a lot at stake, because if you know California's greenhouse gas emissions, its mobile sources are the primary contributor, and it's growing. So this is just a timeline of things that have happened. And that's why I want to give credit to decades of involvement of Californians in these policies. We started the first California Energy Commission. We're second to none on appliance and energy efficiency standards. We started in 2002 the first vote on a renewable portfolio standard. What does that mean? That means that there's a percentage of your energy mix you get into your home or your business that comes from clean renewable sources. It was the most controversial thing to pass in the legislature. All the utilities were opposed, and it passed in 2002 at 20%. And then we find, and surprisingly so, by creating a market for investment in renewable energy, the price of photovoltaics went down, and it exploded as a cost-effective way to produce energy. So what just passed last year, what percentage? 100%. So we've gone from 22% to 33%, then 50%. As of today, the city of Los Angeles, I just asked Lauren Faber this the other day, is at 37% renewable energy. That's tremendous. LA was 50% on out-of-state coal. They are shifting from coal to renewable energy. Amazing work in progress. So anytime you want to look at a timeline, and as a former history teacher, I love timelines, the point is a lot of policies have been in place for many, many years, and that's why California's been successful. So the first bill I was involved in, I didn't know any better. I was a freshman legislator. legislator, and sometimes that's better because I had no idea about the power of oil companies and things like that. If you're teaching middle school, you have other things to focus on than oil companies, 13-year-olds. So it passed, very difficult to pass. A lot of opposition. Every day, the John and Ken show from Orange County would get all the motorists to place angry calls in offices of legislators and the governor at the time, Gray Davis. It was an all-out fight. It was a lot more brutal than any other climate fight up there. But it passed, first in the nation to do anything on greenhouse gas emissions, and it focused on the tailpipe of automobiles because we can pass more stringent tailpipe emission standards than the federal government, providing we get a waiver from the EPA. So it passed. Other states had the option of adopting our policy or not. Many states have, and others have been adding to that, including Colorado last year. But it's never over, is it? This is an ongoing fight. So the EPA said we don't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions like criteria air pollutants. So there was a lawsuit by the state of Massachusetts that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and on a 5-4 decision, with Anthony Kennedy from California the deciding factor, it passed. They said, you know, EPA, you do have the authority. Greenhouse gas emissions should be considered just like criteria air pollutants and regulated as such, and they saw the link to it. So then all we have to do now is get a waiver from the Environmental Protection Agency. Boy, is that easier said than done. That was during the Bush administration, Bush #2 administration. Our waiver, for the first time in California history, and it had 40 waivers in a row passed. Every time, like unleaded gas or access to HOV lanes, we have to go through a procedural process of a waiver. Doesn't take an act of Congress, just EPA approval. But this one was denied by the Bush administration. So fast forward. Let's look at how we passed that bill. I wanted to speak a little bit about coalitions because I think that's my lesson that I'd like to share with you on how we were successful. I'm not the best messenger in Sacramento. They don't really need someone who's, I don't know, at the time, middle-aged, sort of white environmentalist talking about pollution and things like that. It's a big state, a lot of different interests. How do you broaden the message? So we started building a coalition. We actually had a team that met almost weekly. There was no way this bill was going to pass without some different messengers. We all realized that. Even the California legislature, which you think is sort of environmentally sensitive, maybe about a third would on the natural vote for an environmental bill, unless you really made the case. So look at these earlier messengers. Local governments, that makes sense because that provides sort of political cover, if you will, for the legislator who represents that area. Back then, we actually went to the editorial boards of major newspapers. May not be as relevant now, but was very important to have the newspapers talking about that David and Goliath fight going on up in Sacramento, because you always want to be on the David side in that fight. Air quality, district people got involved, health and medical organizations. The California Medical Association joined our fight because of the link between air pollution and health outcomes. That was all the link. So did the California Nurses Association, Physicians for Social Responsibility, American Lung Association, like 20 medical groups, great messengers. Those are the people who go visit the legislators in their district offices. Organized labor, building trades, and things like that. When it came with, most of them were on board, not all of them were. Faith-based organizations, people don't always understand that that's an important voice, and there's an organization called the Interfaith Power and Light. Are any of you familiar with them? Good. Amazing. Religious leaders, Jewish, Muslim, Christian faiths, would take out full-page ads. They would go visit legislators. And my final vote for the tailpipe bill, a priest went and visited a San Diego legislator in his home to talk about the moral responsibility of taking care of the planet. And this is someone who went to church every Sunday, and his wife sitting there looking at. Anyway, he was my 41st vote. I won't name names, but he's now in Congress, and he brags about being on the right side of this particular issue, but you can figure out that is. So we had environmental organizations. Again, they are not the defining voice. And then we started getting business organizations. And I'm going through this list because no matter where you are or if you have connections in other states, these are the same players that are still in the room today that are important to reach out to again. So, of course, the ski industry, right? They have a very big self-interest in making sure that there's not global climate change. And Patagonia, but this was the beginning of our efforts in building coalitions, and it made all the difference. It takes 41 votes to pass a bill in the state assembly. We got 41 votes. That's how close it was. In the Senate, it was a little easier. For those of you who might, if you remember who John Burton was, head of the state Senate, he didn't give everyone an option. This is what strong leadership is like. He told, for example, the labor group, because the UAW, United Automobile Workers, were opposing the bill. He said, you have two choices, everyone. You can be supporting this bill, or you can stay neutral. But that's your only choices. And if you decide to oppose this bill, I'll remember that. So I thought, well, there's an interesting history lesson. So we missed that kind of leadership is amazing. It makes a difference to have the right people in the right places at the right time. It's all about timing. So fast forward, the waiver is denied. President Obama comes into office, and right after he came into office, about 5 months later, it was May of 2009, I took this picture. I'm in the front row of the White House Rose Garden, and President Obama is surrounded by all the CEOs of domestic and foreign automobile manufacturers, announcing that now, after suing in 5 states, they all love the California regulations. And in fact, they will be intertwined with the Federal Department of Transportation fuel efficiency standards. States can't regulate miles per gallon fuel efficiency standards, only the federal government can, but states like California can regulate what comes out of our tailpipes, and it's important legal distinction. This is what's under attack right now, getting rid of those fuel efficiency standards, 35 miles an hour or 54 miles per hour by 2025. It's done on a fleet average, for those of you who want to understand this a little bit. So Ford Motor Company, their fleet average would be 35 miles an hour or whatever by 2020. That means from all their classes of vehicles, from their pickup trucks to their SUVs to other cars, the average would be 35 miles per hour. So if they're selling a lot of big Ford pickup trucks, then they would have to sell perhaps a lot of electric cars to get that fleet average. And so it provided them some flexibility, and they liked that. And they all told me all they want is one national standard, not California doing its own thing, but we want one national standard. And now we're under attack again. Fast forward, with transportation being our most significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, in AB 32, we realized in 2006 we needed a multi-sector approach. That means not just vehicles, but we're looking at fuels. The low carbon fuel standard came from this. Renewable energy, by now we went from 20% to 33% average. Sitting and signing that bill is Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can't tell, but that was a cold, foggy day in San Francisco on Treasure Island. We were freezing to death signing the climate change bill, so all the stories had to be about that. You see a very young Gavin Newsom back in the upper corner there, and the tall gentleman in the back, sort of near Governor Schwarzenegger, that was a Republican governor of New York at the time who flew out for this, Governor Pataki. So it was a bipartisan kind of approach. But look at how our coalition is built. So we learned from the tailpipe bill, and we kept all those people together. I would show up at, I've done a lot of Shabbats. I'm not Jewish, but I've been at temples on Fridays, churches. All these people are part of the original coalition. I made sure I paid attention to them all during this year. So by the time the tailpipe bill, had been passed, and we're past AB 32, our coalition had tripled in size. But the one thing I wanted to point out to you is the big increase of businesses engaged in this. Yes, clean technology business and startup. We've seen a cap on emissions from AB 32 really created that market signal for investment and innovation here in California. But many businesses, small businesses and other size, were getting on board. Solar companies, we have 10 major solar companies in California. They all tell me, we're here because of your policies, not in spite of them. They have been made profitable, and they like having the regulations and that market signal. So this is a good lesson here on how you can build a constituency. One group I didn't put on here, because they really became more visible right after AB 32 passed, was the military. There was a period of about 5-7 years during the Obama administration that the military really was visible. They would actually testify at hearings with their ribbons or medals, and from the Marines, and particularly the Navy, doing amazing things, talking about the national security risk associated with climate change. Really important leaders. When I was down in San Diego having a hearing, their local newspapers were paying attention to the hearings because people from Pendleton and their Navy bases were testifying at those hearings about sea level rise, mass migrations of people causing unrest as moving from one country to the next, the loss of lives of protecting oil caravans in Afghanistan, and other stories like that, the amount of bases that are going to be lost because of sea level rise. I spoke to someone who represents the Navy at hearings. I said, how's that going now with the Trump administration? And they said, we just don't call it climate change anymore. But they're still doing a lot of things. I hope this is not being recorded, but they're doing a lot of things that are just smart business, getting more energy efficient buildings on bases to lower the costs. They have biofuel facilities on bases. The Navy base in Ventura County, here's something great that they're doing. There's a company called Biodiesel. It's on the base. They're selling low carbon aviation fuels that are operating in the Pacific Fleet for the United States Navy. They're doing some amazing things. It's just not as visible right now. But just to let you know, they're incredibly important messengers. Well, we thought everything was going along just fine. Then the recession hit, and timing is everything. And once the recession hit, a group of oil companies led by Valero and Tesoro from Texas, primarily, put a initiative on the ballot. They paid for signature gatherers and got it on the ballot in 2010. It was an all-out fight, and Proposition 23 was going to undo AB 32. Now, this is really easy to remember. I don't know how they lucked out and got that number, but the opposite of 32 is 23, and that was what was on the ballot. You can see the people opposing the Texas Oil Initiative. We made sure everyone in California knew that this was coming from and funded by Texas. People don't like that in California. So, but you can see the bipartisan support in the opposition, not only George Shultz, but Arnold Schwarzenegger. And at the time, he running against Meg Whitman, who was also opposed. There was consistency in opposition in California. And then the people that called Yes on 23, the Jobs First initiative, we were in a recession. The time was right for them to try to stop this, were the lists there, including the Taxpayer Association, the Republican Party. And this is when things started to get more partisan than they needed to be. It was a different framing of it. Well, let's see how it turned out. Oh, over 61% of Californians voted against Proposition 23. That's really amazing. And look at all those red areas. Those are the people who voted no. That's the wasn't just coastal California, was it? It was a broad constituency. And I do think having out-of-state oil companies telling us what to do, not only because it's a fossil fuel, but out-of-state, really resonated. And even our relatively conservative LA Daily News said the last thing we need to do is have a bill that gave the authority to delay AB 32 anytime the economy was poor. You could delay it. And they said the last thing business needs is uncertainty. They need to know that there is a market and consistency, and they'll make that investment to move forward. So we've been in this fight where we've met all our AB 32 standards before 2020. That's a good thing. But that was the low-hanging fruit, frankly. That's the easier things to do. We're ramping up renewables and energy efficiency. Everyone loves that. We've done some stuff on tailpipes of vehicles, providing we keep the federal government away. But how do we get to the next goal? That's where you see Senate Bill 32, the 40% by 2030. How do we keep not only reducing what we had done, but add to that? And that's what's going on right now in Sacramento, where we could use your constant support and ideas. So part of AB 32 was a policy called cap and trade. But I want to make it clear to you, AB 32 was really about a suite of policies that were in effect or adopted during those 5-year period. Our clean car standards, right? Renewable energy, low carbon fuel standard, energy efficiency in appliances and buildings. And we also did some work on black carbon and diesel. That's the emission reduction strategies. It had strong enforcement, and part of AB 32 was all major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions had to establish a baseline, and there are protocols in place to measure how much emissions reductions are occurring at your facility, let's say a power plant or something like that. You can actually measure it. It's reportable, it is verified, and you can document it. So there's no reason to have these policies if you don't know and you can't measure their effectiveness. So that was, cap and trade was about 16% of the emissions reductions. And some people think AB 32 and cap and trade are the same thing. No, no, no. Suite of policies with the backstop called cap and trade. The cap was the important market signal. The trading gave some flexibility to some businesses who didn't need to use all their allowances they had to purchase. And they could either bank them or they could trade them. But at the end of the day, you had to get the emission reductions. That was the thing. This wasn't going to work if you weren't really reducing emissions. It can't just be a trading scheme. And the market signal was sent, and it has been a workable policy. Something that has to be enforced and it has to be well run, and if it needs to be changed, it does. At the end of the day, there's discussion all over what's the best way to price carbon. This is an option. Carbon tax is an option. They can all work together. And in my opinion, getting in a big disagreement about that nuance isn't as important as getting these policies in place that really can quantify emissions reductions. It has to be both, price on carbon and the policies there, and the accountability that comes with it. So one of my last years in office in 2016, I knew AB 32 was supposed to end at 2020. We did it in 10-year increments because it's real hard to tell the business community what all technologies will be available 30 or 40 years from now. So we sort of put this in 10-year periods of time where you could sort of understand the market and what's going on and the technologies to be able to do something. 15 years ago, we had no idea we could be championing 100% renewable energy. But the market signals were sent and the price of photovoltaics went down, and it's great. So SB 32 was signed in 2016. We're standing in Los Angeles. And one of the things that interests me in this picture is how times have changed from AB 32. This reflects the diversity of support in California for our climate policies. Why? One of the reasons is we've really linked the outcomes in AB 32 to increase the jobs, particularly locally, and the co-benefit of reducing criteria air pollutants, the health impacts and outcomes. So on this particular bill, I just extended AB 32, and as someone who's not very good with math, I just keep the same numbers rolling, AB 32, SB 32. But I linked my bill with Eduardo Garcia's bill, AB 197. Co-linked. That means if his didn't pass, mine didn't pass either, and vice versa. And so that was a gamble, but it was an important signal. If you don't know Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia, he's in Sacramento now, and he's really one of the key leaders on climate change policies. He's articulate. You should have him come speak to your organization if he hasn't already. So this bill was signed, or both bills were signed, and it's being implemented right now. So let's look at some of the funding priorities. This was a bill by Eduardo Garcia that passed in 2017 that looked where the funds from cap and trade investment should be going. Over a third of the money is going to disadvantaged communities. We recognize that that's a key part of this. So those are the basic categories. Growing amount of funds to short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon, but primarily methane from dairies, major source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. But the good thing about investing in short-lived climate pollutants, we call them super pollutants, is that if you can reduce those, they'll have the biggest sort of bang for your buck, if you will, in reducing emissions more quickly than some of the other strategies. So these are the priority areas of investment. The one concern that I partially have, and you can help fill this in, we're seeing a growing amount of the emissions reductions strategies for that next 2020 to 2030 segment coming from cap and trade. What I think we need to do collectively together is figure out what are some of those implementing policies that really reduce emissions quantifiably in order to reach those targets. Would it be eliminating natural gas power plants? Oh, that could be one. Would it be electrifying all our homes, water heaters and everything else? That would be one. So I think you'll see the discussion in the next few years. What other kinds of policies besides short-lived climate pollutants like methane or energy efficiency, or how can we make sure all buses are electric? We're going to be there in 5 to 10 years. Did you know that? All buses will be electric. And the best news is 2 of the plants that actually put the assembly plants for these buses are in Southern California. Proterra has one, I think just outside of, maybe it's in LA County, someone else can tell me that. And then there's one, BYD, up in Lancaster. So the jobs too with it. Our biggest challenge is how do we make sure this goes into school buses as well? And that's, you need a gradual turnover of the fleet and then electrify it. But you'll see in the next few years electric buses everywhere. And they're cost effective, cleaner, and you don't need as much, you don't have to go to the shop to have it constantly repaired. If you haven't seen this graph, you go to the Air Resources Board website or the California Energy Commission website, and they show you graphically. It's a real good one for showing people you're speaking to about some of the strategies for our 2030 vision. Here's our biggest challenge, transportation. It's 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and it's actually growing and not going down. We're going back to our SUVs. We are also growing in population. We have to keep building transit, and yes, transit-oriented developments, and lower carbon fuels. Lower carbon fuel standard, 10% reduction in carbon intensity of fuel is increasing to 20%, and we're seeing businesses and biofuels actually being built. Here's a good success story for you. There's this company called Alt Air in Paramount, California, near Long Beach. They took an old oil refinery, closed it down, trained the workers to work in a biofuel refinery. The only challenge is you have to put a lot of money into a biofuel refinery, and you don't know if anyone's going to buy your product. United Airlines stepped in and has a long-term contract with them in low-carbon aviation fuels that now is going to LAX. So they're tripling the size of their facility and jobs. That's a success story, right? And they're not a bad neighbor. They've done such wonderful jobs with reducing emissions and their employee policies and everything else that people who live in Paramount or the city officials all say wonderful things about them. It's a great facility to visit, too. So these are some of our strategies in transportation. How do we cut petroleum fuel use by half? So here's our challenge in California. We'll eventually close down our half a dozen refineries, but if we're importing oil from other states, that's even worse on the full life cycle analysis. So thank you. So these are some strategies done by the Union of Concerned Scientists and what we can do to reduce our oil dependency, and we're going to need all of the above strategies. Here's something that I got interested in, and I don't know if you've heard about the water energy nexus. Does that sound familiar to you? 18 to 20% of all the energy we use in the state of California is moving, treating, and heating water. Think about that. So you can, do water conservation, but how about putting things like renewable energy to use to power water if you have to move them over the Tehachapi's or down from Mono Lake area, or renewable energy if you're using reusing water. We're going to be using water not just once, but 2 or 3 times, but that's very energy intensive. We've got to make sure that we're not just using natural gas or something for that. So we're going to have to put renewable energy combined with water delivery and other strategies. The protocols for measuring the amount of carbon embedded in delivery of water is coming out in May of this year. The California Environmental Protection Agency, this is my last bill in office, the Water Energy Nexus. They're coming out in May with their registry program so they can measure it. No real opposition to the bill because even the water companies want to be as energy efficient as possible because of their bottom line. Also, if you capture stormwater, like during our last rainstorms, and we use it instead of relying on imported water in a volatile Sierra snowpack, that would make a lot of sense for a variety of reasons. So some of the key technologies in reaching the future goal, besides changing behavior and putting in transportation, it's all about battery storage. If you have money, that's where I'd put it, to have investment and ramping up battery storage. Alternative fuels, lower carbon fuels, of course getting people out of their cars and bicycle communities, good. Did you all drive here? Never mind. And zero emission cars, ramping up electric vehicles or hydrogen cars as well. We are in a race. Every time I get sort of depressed, like turning on the news, you have to stop and go back and see what you've done. So I think several people articulated up here. You have to celebrate your victories, large or small. For many of you, starting locally is the best thing you can do, changing the minds of people around you and getting engaged in the best way you know how. And so what should you do now? This is just suggestions off the top of my head. Yes, constantly educate yourselves and others. Speak to people who aren't already your best supporters, but would be good listeners. You're holding forums all over the place. This organization is great. The third one, identify organizations in other states that you can partner with. Really important. In California, we tend to talk to each other a lot. Go try talking to people in some other states and find some common ground with them. Select the best messengers and message for your audience and your outreach efforts. And the fifth bullet down, build coalitions. And here's a suggestion, because health being such an important messaging tool. The American Lung Association has every month is a different theme. And this year's theme is Year of Air Pollution and Public Health. They have amazing resources. They're involved in 30 other states. Maybe you can double up that kind of outreach with them. They do a lot on social media and are always looking for people to spread. They have factual information. They do state-of-the-air reports every year in 30 different states and major cities. Really important resource, and they're doing a great job right here in California. This is the California American Lung Association. And I think that's it, and thank you very much for allowing me to spend the morning with you.